The walls of Nineveh crumbled like dust blown by the wind. Fire consumed the gleaming temples. The palaces crumbled to ashes, and screams of terror echoed through the streets that once boasted pride and arrogance. The river, engulfed in fury, overflowed the city, sweeping away bodies and ruins, erasing the fragile glory of an empire that had believed itself eternal. The once feared king crawled among the shadows, rejected by his own servants, unable to stop the apocalypse that crushed his crown. Only judgment remained. From atop a hill, Nahum gazed in silence. He had already announced the end. His voice echoed like thunder splitting the heavens. "Behold, I am against you, Nineveh. Your end has come." But no one believed. Now the city that had defied the Most High was unrecognizable, consumed by fire and submerged by water. But what really made Nineveh a target of divine judgment? What hidden mystery lay beneath its walls, guarded for centuries in the city's depths? What was the secret buried in its foundations, so dark that not even kings dared reveal it? Join us as we unravel the small but powerful book of the prophet Nahum, where the walls of Nineveh tremble, the cries of oppression echo, and God's justice is proclaimed without turning back. Prepare to discover the secret hidden beneath the ruins, the eternal reminder that no human arrogance can escape the Lord's judgment. Nahum is the protagonist of this story. His name in Hebrew means consolation, or one who brings relief. But the curious thing is that before providing comfort, he was called to announce judgment. Scripture opens with solemnity, the burden of Nineveh. The book of the vision of Nahum the Elkoshite, Nahum 1:1. We don't know much about his family. The Bible doesn't record his mother, siblings, or children. It only mentions his origin. Elkos, a small town whose exact location has been lost to time. The silence of Scripture regarding his ancestry teaches us that the essential thing was not his lineage, but the message he carried. The scene takes place in Judah, at a time when the Assyrian Empire, with its capital in Nineveh, was rising to fear. These were days of oppression, violence, and cruelty. Many Jews lived in terror, remembering the Assyrian military campaigns, marked by destruction and bloodshed. In this landscape of dust, heat, and fear, Nahum raised his voice. "Listen, all of you." The prophet shouted firmly without wavering. "The Lord is a jealous and avenging God. The Lord takes vengeance and is full of wrath. He takes vengeance on his adversaries and will not leave the guilty unpunished." The words echoed like thunder through the market. Some stopped trading. Others laughed out loud, mocking. "Another preacher of doom," shouted a cloth merchant, provoking laughter from the circle around him. "That's right," added another. "If his God were so powerful, he would have destroyed Nineveh by now." Nahum was not intimidated. His eyes burned like embers. "The Lord is slow to anger, but great in power. Do not think that delay means weakness. His patience is mercy, but his justice never fails." People looked at each other uneasily. A young man, his face tanned by the sun, whispered to his friend, "Do you feel that? It's like the ground vibrates when he speaks." "Don't talk nonsense. It's just the wind that moves the dust," the other replied, trying to hide his discomfort. High up on the walls, the sentries were also stirring. One of them rested his spear against the stone and spoke softly. "I can't explain it, but that voice gives me goosebumps. It sounds like it's talking about a storm." The companion laughed, embarrassed. "Storm? The sky is clear, just dust and heat." "Yes, but inside me, I feel something moving." In the square, Nahum raised his hands to the sky. "The Lord marches in the whirlwind and in the storm. The clouds are the dust of his feet. He rebukes the sea and dries it up. He makes the rivers dry up. The mountains quake before him. Who can stand?" An uncomfortable silence fell over part of the crowd. The mockery gave way to suspicious looks. A woman tugged at her daughter's arm. "Let's go, I don't want you to hear those words of doom." But the girl resisted. Her eyes shone. "Mom, what if it's true?" An old shepherd approached, leaning on his staff. Man of Elkos, why do you speak against Nineveh? Are you not afraid that they will persecute you? Nahum stared at him firmly. I do not speak against, but in the name of the Lord. His justice cannot be silenced. Some scoffed again, but now there was less confidence in their laughter. Those words carried weight, like distant thunder, not yet frightening, but announcing the coming storm. On the wall, the sentries exchanged uneasy glances. The youngest asked, "What do you see on the horizon?" The other narrowed his eyes, trying to see past the dust. I only see the wind lifting sand, but I feel like something is coming. What if what this man says is true? The younger man insisted. The veteran sighed, adjusting the helmet on his head. If that's true, then none of us are prepared for what's coming. But will the people have the courage to listen before it is too late? Are you going to listen after all? Asked the youngest sentry, still on the parapet, dust clinging to his face. Some pretend not to, replied the veteran, but the voice has already entered through the crack of pride. Nahum left the square and headed for the north gate. The rumor of the foreign prophet spread ahead. The wide corridor smelled of leather and oil. Guards laughed, spears raised like teeth. Behind them, storerooms, wheat piled high, sealed amphorae, rolls of royal cloth, metal bars. And deeper, the armory, varnished chariots, polished shields, drawn bows, full quivers. There were blades on the wheels, hooks on the chains, spikes on the gauntlets. Everything gleamed. Nineveh displayed its treasures like a lion baring its fangs. "Is that him?" asked an officer weighing the bracelets. "From Elkos, sir. Speak of the God of Judah." "Judah," he smiled wryly. Shepherds giving their opinions on empires. Scouts marched. Hooves thudded against the ground. Nahum stopped where the echo was loudest and spoke as if reading a signed decree. "The Lord has seen the lion's den. Where is the strong man's den? The pasture of the young, where the lion carried off his prey and no one defied him. I tell you, the torch finds the stubble and the roaring is silenced." The officers laughed. "He recites verses," said one. "He doesn't keep count. How many cars? How many men?" "Do it yourselves," replied another, ironically. "And offer the whole to heaven." Nahum raised his hand. "He who trusts in the armory wears empty armor. The Lord weighs pride like sand in a shell. When he blows, the storehouse collapses." The laughter faded for a moment. The word supra was heard around the yard. A captain broke the silence. "Have you come to sell fear?" "We buy iron here." "I don't sell," said Nahum. "I warn you. The lion's day passes. The den becomes hollow. The prey flees. The name carved fades away. How do you extinguish stone?" The captain scoffed. "With the finger that wrote the mountains," replied the prophet. A caravan of supplies entered. Merchants displayed ivory, furs, and amphorae. Women passed with baskets, children ran, soldiers trained. Fresh bread, animal sweat, and currency readily available. Everything said safety. Everything said no one will touch us. Carved lions guarded the door. "See," a general got out of the car. "Warehouses full, arsenal ready, rivers contained. Our roar scares the wind." "The wind is not afraid," said Nahum. "It comes when it is called. Call then." "Our gods will laugh," growled the general. "Idols laugh with mouths of stone." "The Lord speaks," said the prophet. They laughed in unison. A cupbearer brought wine. The foam stained the floor. A harpist played to stifle omens. The palace promised long life with its marble lions. An officer twisted his gold earring. "If Nineveh is a den, where are the hunters?" "I don't need to see them," said Nahum. "The steps have already been counted." "My steps cannot be counted." He beat his chest. "They count as the last breath," replied the prophet. A scout arrived, dirty from the road, and whispered something. The general frowned and hid it with a laugh. Just dust in the distance. The stranger brought wind, nothing more. Nahum looked at the sky. Hard, cloudless. He saw walls like hills, gates like towers, stones polished by triumphs. He spoke softly, and everyone heard. When the Lord decides, the river changes course, the gate becomes a trail, the spear forgets the hand that holds it. He who laughs at the word laughs at himself. We have magicians, astrologers, maps of the sky, said the general. What do you have? A written vision. It does not lie, said Nahum. In the market, an old man whispered. He speaks as if he has already seen tomorrow. Silence, his wife said. Soldiers, listen. A young soldier stared at the prophet for too long. The captain nudged his arm. March. Yes, sir, he said, still looking at Nahum. On the other side, children played roaring. A boy climbed onto the stone lion and raised his arms. The wind made a small whirlwind at the prophet's feet and died down near his sandals. I heard your God is good, the cupbearer taunted. Why so many threats? Kindness protects the weak, said Nahum. The wounded cry reached heaven. Toast to the power of Nineveh. The general raised his glass. I toast to the God who knocks down and raises up, he replied. His hand does not err. The shadow of the gate lengthened. The metal rang hollow. A messenger came from the river, asked for water, and was dismissed. He gave the prophet a quick glance and disappeared. Nahum pointed. Even water fears when fear comes first. Fear, laughed the captain. There's only courage here. Courage without truth is noise, said the prophet. At the top, the younger sentry reappeared. He looked for the veteran. Nahum lifted his chin, greeting him from afar. The young man hesitated, as if he wanted to descend. He stayed, perhaps out of duty, perhaps out of pride. A word of advice, said the general. Go back to Elkos. No one here will buy your word. I don't sell it, Nahum replied. I leave it as a seed. Who will water? The appointed day. Laughter. The harp ran, the chariots spun, the wheels gleamed like tamed beasts. 2 stone lions guarded the gate with open mouths. The courtyard vibrated with applause. Nahum looked at a child and murmured, Who will teach the little one that the roar of pride is an echo? Speak loudly, stranger, the captain mocked. Does your God fear heights? No, said Nahum, fear the void. The wind returned, stronger. The general, wanting to end the conversation, called for scribes. Record, he ordered. Nineveh invincible has added today 10 more chariots, 50 spears, and 100 shields. Write it down in full, the prophet said calmly, because the count will also be read on the day of reckoning. An old veteran limped over. I've seen cities that swore they were eternal, he said wearily. They all had full warehouses. And how did they end? Asked the young soldier. More silent than dust, the old man murmured. The wind always finds the door. The general shrugged. Old men's tales. Our lion doesn't age. We feed the den every day. Whoever feeds the den becomes food, replied the prophet. An Assyrian priest came out of the temple and sprinkled perfume. The gods accepted the offerings. The smell rises, but the guilt remains, said Nahum. The laughter, the music, the clang of metal, everything seemed louder than the truth. Yet some held on to the words like embers in the ashes. Some pretended to sleep, but they heard. The sky remained iron. One servant counted coins. Another brought wine. Pride ascended the stairs as king. Last chance, said the general. Go back. Tell them Nineveh is safe. I will say that the safety of Nineveh is like a cloth stretched before the fire, answered Nahum. What if the fire doesn't come? He teased. Then I have erred before men. You will err before God, said the prophet. The final laugh rang out thickly like a drum. For a moment, everything was a celebration. Nahum turned to leave. Few noticed the sentinel above. His fingers dug into the stone. The wind carried a sound that was neither music nor voice. The young man sought out the veteran and whispered, pale, Do you hear? What? As if the wall were breathing. And if it's not just the wind, will you come down with me now? Go down now. The veteran took a deep breath and rubbed the stone with his palm. If the captain notices, we'll be out of pay and out of skin. Then change the round, the youngest insisted. Tell me you'll check the gate. I feel Like the joints in the wall are creaking, the courtyard lit up. Blacksmiths pounded tirelessly. The air smelled of embers and leather. Hammers sang like a rain of iron. Wheels, axles, armor, harnesses. Men tested belts and oiled joints. The streets, swept by sparks, glowed like fire. The armory bells rang out in short bursts. Each chime summoned a trade. Collar makers brought new straps. Saddlers measured buckles. Hammerers tuned nail heads. The stringmaster stretched straps until they groaned, and the wheelwright pressed his ear to the hub, listening for the hidden squeak. The ground under the soot bore ancient campaign marks, and someone traced them with their foot, as if reading memories. In the pit, apprentices blew bellows, and the embers responded with a living tongue. Smoke rose in streamers sticking to the ceiling. A steward checked seals on amphorae, and coachmen spoke softly to the horses, urging calm. In the corner, an old woman sewed a leather strap. She swore that good leather does not betray the first light. Listening, Nahum thought of the city. Too much shine on the outside, too little listening within. The hammer fell silent for a moment, and everyone felt the hollowness of the sound, as if the city were waiting for a signal. Then the iron sang again, faster, and the sparks streaked the air like stars driven by the wind. The king wanted such brilliance. "They've woken the chariots," said a soldier proudly. "Today their roar will silence the stranger." "Wood roars need hands," the youngest replied, already descending the ladder. "The wind doesn't." Nahum passed the armory. Shields hung like moons, spears in bundles, chariots with blades on their wheels and new kanzis. A master blacksmith looked up. "Prophet, the wheels turn smoothly. At noon the king will see the iron dance." "Dance that treads wheat," said Nahum. "He who sows fear reaps terror." "I work with fire," said the blacksmith. "It either consumes or extinguishes. There is a fire that purifies and a fire that devours," Nahum replied. "What are you lighting today?" A herald crossed the courtyard. "Orders of the king." Maneuvers throughout the city. Cars on axles, horses harnessed. "Show that rumor is dust." "What rumor?" Someone shouted. "Superstitions," said the herald. "Rumors of omens and a God who speaks." The king orders fear to be silenced with wheels. Generals gathered under an awning. Maps on boards, stones marking streets. The eldest spoke. "Do you want to whisper a storm? We will respond with clarity. Chariots in the north, cavalry in the east, infantry in the palace. We will pass through the market and the temple. Let them see the brightness. Today the city will be a machine. Machine without a soul is death," murmured Nahum, "and a soul without truth is short of breath." "You again," said the captain from the previous day. "You'll see how the gears sing." "Sing until the axle asks for rest," said Nahum. Orders spread. Men tightened pins, greased and tied straps. Horses neighed, eyes alive. The ground shook with the pounding of boots. A horn blared and swept across the rooftops. The city wanted to see their power. "Look," the younger sentry said to the veteran, already in the courtyard. "The stones are red with sparks." "Beautiful fire deceives ugly pain," the old man replied. "The parade ends. The night remembers. The sedan chair came from the palace. The king raised his hand, a brief smile. Behind him, priests and soothsayers. The herald raised his voice. "Nineveh, look at your chariots. Today fear dies." The crowd cheered. The first car pulled away. Its wheels squealed. The second scraped its hub and threw sparks. The third arrived with fanned spears. The smell of oil wafted up. Children imitated warriors, and mothers smiled for a moment. Nahum walked along the edge, close to the eyes. "How many nights did you sleep, son?" he asked a young soldier. "2 bad nights," he replied. "The city needs to show strength." "A force that does not hear is deaf," said the prophet. "A deaf alert is worth more than gold." A general passed by in a shiny car. "Today your warnings will be dust," he said. "Dust rises easily," said Nahum, "then it falls into the lungs." The maneuvers continued in the square. Blacksmiths scurried to fix whatever was loose. A pin gave way, an axle groaned, a piece of leather cracked. Nothing serious, they said. The music of the wheels covered the floors. Do you see the temple? The sentry pointed. The sacred doesn't need a parade, said the veteran. It needs silence. In the market, the stalls retreated. The king raised his hand, and the chariots sped forward. Wheels scraped the stone. The houses vibrated. A jar fell and shattered. A child covered his ears. The sound is beautiful, said the butler. It's beautiful when life breathes, said Nahum. Today the city holds the air. The sun beat down on the armor. Horses sweated. An officer poured water on the neck of one of them. The major general shouted, "See, iron obeys. Fear is silent." The Lord sees the wheels and weighs the hands, Nahum said. Those who trust in axles forget that dust eats iron. Those who hide in the crowd forget that God calls by name. A long crack rose from the street. The second carriage groaned. Blacksmiths rushed forward. They adjusted the carriage, and the carriage moved on. The king waved impatiently, "Don't stop. The city must see perfection." "Perfection is tiring," someone whispered. They took over the temple. Incense rose. The king smiled at the stone gods. "Smoke dances." "Truth remains," said Nahum. "A perfumed idol is a clean stone." The captain brushed the wheel against the prophet's cloak. "Get off the track. There's no room for omens today." "I bring no omen," said Nahum. "I bring memory. Every time pride beats the drum, the night responds with silence." "What night?" "The one that erases the blade and leaves only the hand." The procession returned through the wealthy neighborhoods and along the street of potters. The warm ground smelled of baked clay. The wheel tracks crisscrossed like a web. On the rooftops, men clapped their hands. The herald shouted, "Nineveh does not fear." Nahum stopped at a well. An old woman gave him water. "Drink, man of Elkos, your voice is tiring." "Thank you, Mom. I'm not thirsty today for water." "Of what?" "That the eyes may see and the ears may learn." The afternoon fell. The brightness turned to weariness. The smell of oil weighed heavily. The horses asked for shade. A blacksmith sat for a moment and then stood up. The senior general raised his arm. "One more turn to the west. I want the red of the sun on the blades." "I still feel the wall creaking," said the sentry. "Listen inside," said the old man. "If the heart cracks, the stone follows." Nahum stared at the horizon. The king wanted the perfect picture. The people, tired, pretended to celebrate. The prophet said, "The day of the gears ends when the hand of the Lord touches the axis of time." No one can hold that hand. The captain pulled the reins before the prophet. "The city has spoken." "You lost." "The city has spoken loudly," said Nahum, "but who has told the truth?" The wind rushed and extinguished torches. A boy lifted the broken jar, trying to gather the pieces. The king gazed into the sunset. The herald prepared his final words, and the youngest sentry, hand on his chest, whispered to the veteran, "If the wall breathes again, and the ground asks for silence, you come with me down there. Or will you tell the king that the city needs to hear before night falls?" Before we continue, we ask for your support. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This helps us continue to bring powerful messages like that of Nahum, the prophet who announced that the seemingly invincible city would be reduced to ashes, and that the oppressed people would finally claim victory. Now let's move on to the fall of Nineveh and the revelation that changes everything. "So, are you going to speak or are you going to keep quiet?" the veteran asked, staring at the younger man, who was still holding his chest with his hand. "Yes, I will, but not to the king. First, I need to understand what this weight I feel is." Dawn had barely broken when strange trumpets cut through the silence. They weren't the festive sounds of Nineveh, nor the herald's call for maneuvers. They were long, hard, like blades blown by the wind. On the horizon, as the light began to paint the hills, banners were raised and ranks moving. Severe discipline, men marching together, spears in order, shields gleaming. These were no rumors. A true army was approaching. The noise spread through the streets. Doors slammed. Women pulled their children inside. Merchants pushed carts into the alleys. In the palace, officials hurried to hold hurried councils. "Are they just hunters?" asked a servant. "No," a general replied. "They are men of war. They come too closely aligned for hunting." Nahum, standing at the gate, watched without fear. The Lord raises winds and raises up nations. The human arm obeys God's timing. "Prophet, be quiet." A captain shouted, "Today Nineveh will show strength," and so they tried. The king ordered a military parade. The chariots, still warm from the day before, were put back on the road. Local trumpets answered the distant trumpets. The ground shook with cavalry. Lancers marched as if the noise itself were a wall. Shields raised, spears fanned, war cries trained. The people came out to watch. Some clapped, others just watched, tense. The king raised his crown to the sun. "The river is our moat. The walls are our skin," he declared confidently. "A river may dry up, a wall may crack," Nahum said firmly. "The Lord weighs every stone," the general next door laughed. "Still that foreigner? If the enemy arrives, they'll see how our towers spit fire." "Towers do not hold eternal judgment," replied the prophet. The sun rose, and the enemy banners became clearer. They were red, embroidered with symbols of conquest. Their drums beat rhythmically. With each beat, hearts in Nineveh leaped, even behind the walls. "They don't stop," said the youngest sentry. "They march as if the ground were theirs." "Be quiet," the veteran scolded. "Our duty is to watch, not to fear." But what if the prophet is right? In the square, cars spun in circles, their sharp blades flashing. Children screamed with excitement, but mothers held them by the arms. A jar fell and shattered, and the sound of the wheels drowned out the omen. Nahum raised his voice. "Woe to the bloodthirsty city, full of lies, full of robbery. The theft of prey does not depart from it. Behold, one hears the crack of a whip, the rumble of wheels, horses trampling, chariots racing furiously." Some cringed. Others laughed out loud. "Words, words!" an officer shouted. "What we see is strength, not misfortune." But a woman whispered to her son, "Strength does not last without justice." The horizon burned with the dust of enemy armies. The river, which had once seemed like a wall, now reflected banners like a warning mirror. The king, impatient, raised his sword. "Blow the trumpets louder! The city must feel power, not fear." The trumpets of Nineveh exploded with sound. The city trembled, but the hearts of the people did not calm. The veteran looked to the sky. "I've never heard trumpets like that. They sound like blades cutting through the air." "What if they really are blades?" whispered the youngest. "What will we do when they get even closer?" The old man took a deep breath and replied in a low voice, "Perhaps the question is not what we will do, but what God has already decided to do with us." What if that's really what God has already decided to do with us? The youngest repeated, still looking at the dust-covered horizon. "Then there is no wall or river that can hold it back," the veteran replied, his voice hoarse, while the sounds of trumpets echoed like blades in the air. That morning, the city's gaze turned not only to the armies looming in the distance, but to the very heart of its defense, the mighty Tigris River. For centuries, it had served as a natural wall, a liquid barrier against invaders, a mirror where banners mingled with reflections. The rains had fallen heavily on the distant mountains, and now the riverbed roared louder, bringing waters that crashed against the dikes with a dull fury. The engineers of Nineveh paced back and forth, checking floodgates, reinforcing locks, inspecting timber and stone. Sweat ran down their foreheads, but their lips did not waver. "Everything under control," they said in unison. "The river obeys the hands that measure it. Do you obey?" Nahum repeated, standing by the walls overlooking the waters. "The Lord commands the river. When he speaks, even the current changes its course." One of the engineers laughed nervously as he knocked on the stone structure. "Look, these dikes were built by kings who ruled nations. The river has never betrayed us." "The river doesn't need to betray," the prophet replied. "It just needs to obey the one who created it." The crowd gathered to listen. Some trusted in the city's safety. Others began to feel a chill run down their spines. A woman whispered to her husband, "Yesterday was a parade. Today is the river. Doesn't this man ever tire of announcing misfortune?" "No, he's not tired. But I wish he would shut up," the husband replied, even as his eyes betrayed fear. The sound of the water grew louder. The tiger roared, crashing against the rocks with unusual force. The engineers assured her that everything was secure. "The king wants a report," an officer shouted. "Tell him there's no risk." Nahum raised his voice so that everyone could hear. "The floodgates will be opened. The Lord has decreed. The river will be the gate, and those who bring judgment will enter through it." The laughter that echoed in the squares this time didn't come. Some still tried to mock. "Will the river open? How if the stone is thick and the iron is strong?" But the tone was forced, and nervousness broke the firmness. Above, the younger sentry nudged the veteran. "Can you feel it? It feels like the wall is vibrating." "It's not the wall, boy. It's the river asking for passage." The enemy drums sounded closer, and mixed with the roar of the water, they formed an ominous melody. The king, clad in his golden cuirass, raised his sword from the palace balcony. "Nineveh is safe," he shouted. "The waters are our allies, and the gods guard our gates." Nahum did not hesitate. "No, the Lord does not share his glory with mute idols. What you call security will be the path of your downfall. The river, which seemed like a wall, will become an open door." The crowd backed away. The women clutched their children. The engineers pounded on the stone, trying to show their firmness, but their eyes couldn't hide their doubt. The sky darkened in the distance. Lightning streaked across the mountains. The wind brought the scent of rain. The Tigris, swollen, beat against the dikes like a caged beast. The roar of the water was louder than the trumpets. The younger sentry swallowed hard. "What if he's right?" The veteran sighed wearily. "Then it won't be the enemy that opens the way. It will be the river itself." The boy lowered his eyes as if he saw something no one else could see and whispered, "But when the door opens, will we still have time to run?" "Run!" The veteran scratched his thick beard, keeping his eyes on the river that roared ever louder. "Boy, soon no one will be running. The water doesn't choose who it reaches." "But the generals," tried the youngest, unsure. "They would rather applaud wheels than hear thunder," the old man replied bitterly, and as if to prove his point, the streets soon filled with the metallic echo of chariots. The king had ordered the troops to assemble again, to demonstrate that nothing could shake Nineveh. Blacksmiths finished repairs, potters coated wheels with new alloys, and the restless horses were harnessed to golden harnesses. When the gates opened, the chariots poured out like moving torches. The blades of the wheels gleamed in the sun, and the sound of them striking the stones sounded like the howls of a wild beast. People ran onto the sidewalks to watch. Children clapped, but their mothers held them back, fearful. The smell of burning oil and leather soaked with animal sweat filled the air. Archers adjusted their bowstrings, tuning them like musicians before a concert. "Look at this," shouted a general puffed up with pride. "Nineveh is invincible. Who would dare lift a sword against our chariots?" "The man who trusts in wheels forgets who moves the clouds," said Nahum firmly, standing in the corner of the square. A young soldier heard and approached. "Prophet, why do you always speak against us? Don't you see the strength of the city?" "Yes, I do. But I also see the end. The strength that does not fear God lasts less than the brightness of a torch in the wind." The boy lowered his eyes, disturbed, and returned to the line. The training began. Chariots raced in circles, archers fired arrows at straw targets, spears clashed against shields. The ground shook, and each vibration drew nervous applause from the crowd. But suddenly, a strange sound pierced the training ground. It wasn't iron on stone, nor a horse's neigh. It was a dull rumble, coming from deep within. The cars kept racing, but something was making the ground vibrate strangely. "What's this?" muttered a blacksmith, dropping his hammer. "Trembling," Nahum replied. "The river is speaking. The generals ignored it. "Keep going! Faster! I want to see the wheels spark," one of them shouted, and the cars sped off, raising dust and fire. The crowd cheered, but they no longer smiled as before. There was tension in the air. With each lap, the wheels screeched louder as if resisting a greater force. Suddenly, one of the sentries shouted from the top of the wall, "Water! The water is rising faster than yesterday." The noise of the cars stopped for a moment. The generals tried to hide it. "It's just too much rain." The river has always obeyed, but the roar came again, louder. The tiger pounded against the dikes as if trying to break through. Nahum raised his arm, and his voice echoed above the confusion. "This is what the Lord says. The river will be the key. The floodgates will be opened, and the city will see that no wall can withstand the judgment of God." The crowd fell silent. The nervous laughter had disappeared. Even the generals hesitated for a moment at those words. The horses reared in fright, and some chariots nearly collided. The younger sentry looked at the veteran, his eyes wide. "Are you listening? The river won't stop roaring." "I'm listening," the old man replied, pressing his fist against the wall. "And when the current comes, I want to see who will have the courage to keep running." The young man took a deep breath, without taking his eyes off the prophet below, and asked in a choked voice, "And if today is the day the water enters the gates, do you still believe that the king will listen before it is too late? Courage to stand on top of it?" The veteran repeated, his hands still resting on the vibrating stone. "Boy, courage isn't what Nineveh lacks. What it lacks is the wisdom to realize that even the walls have a voice." The early morning hours brought not only the brightness of the sun, but also sounds that made even the bravest hearts waver. They were the rhythmic knocking of wood against wood, accompanied by the snapping of thick ropes being stretched to their limit. The enemy armies had advanced during the night, and now their siege engines stood before the city. From afar, mobile towers could be seen rolling on reinforced wheels, covered with wet hides to resist fire. Catapults lined up like musicians in a macabre symphony, ready to hurl enormous stones against the walls that, until then, the people of Nineveh had believed to be eternal. The youngest sentry held his breath as he saw the first shot. "They started." The veteran nodded seriously. "They have, yes. And every stone thrown will remind the people that pride cannot hold a wall." The impact was deafening. A huge rock slammed into the wall near the east gate. The ground shook as if thunder had been released from beneath the earth. The crowds that had gathered in the squares and streets fell back, but did not flee. Many wanted to watch as if watching were the same as winning. Nahum, standing among the people, raised his voice. "Woe to the bloodthirsty city, full of deceit and robbery. The stones you heard are not just weapons of war. They are the echo of God's justice, which cannot be silenced." Some men tried to laugh, but their laughter came out shaky. A woman clutched her son to her chest and whispered, "What's that noise, Mom?" "It's the wall responding, my son. It's never groaned like that before." Meanwhile, inside the city, master masons were hastily summoned. Their calloused hands ran over every joint in the wall, trying to identify small cracks. One of them, already white-haired, pressed his ear to the stone and remained motionless for a few seconds. When he looked up, he was pale. "The wall groans," he said softly. "I've never heard a sound like it in my entire life." The engineers tried to suppress their fear. Nothing but vibration. The stones were placed by powerful kings. They have held before and will hold again, but not everyone was convinced. Sweat dripped down the faces of the masons as they worked in silence, trying to reinforce old joints with clay and mortar. Each catapult strike seemed to mock their efforts. On the wall, the younger sentry looked back at the veteran. "I told you she breathes. Now you heard it too, didn't you?" "I heard," the old man replied, his voice heavy. "And it's not just breathing. It's moaning, as if the city were tired of carrying so much blood." Outside, the enemy advanced. Siege towers were pushed slowly, covered in wet leather protected from fire. Iron-headed battering rams were swung by dozens of men, pounding against the wooden gates with a terrifying rhythm. Each strike felt like the heart of the city itself skipping a beat. An officer, trying to maintain order, shouted, "Stand firm! These walls have the blessing of our gods. They will never fall." Nahum without fear replied, "There is no blessing in stone that conceals injustice. The Lord of hosts has already decided. What you call strength will be shame." The soldiers laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. Each new impact made teeth grind and eyes meet in silence. It was as if everyone was thinking the same thing, but no one had the courage to speak. The stones launched by the catapults began to chip away at visible fragments. Small fragments rolled down the parapets. A child pointed and shouted, "Look, Mom! The wall is crying dust." The silence that followed was heavier than any stone. Inside the makeshift workshops, masons hurriedly mixed clay, shoving it into the joints of the walls. But the microscopic cracks multiplied, almost invisible to the naked eye. They were too small to be alarming at the moment, but enough to foretell what was to come. Sweat dripped from their calloused faces, and no one said a word. They knew they were fighting the inevitable. The younger sentry looked down at the city, then down at Nahum, and asked in a low voice, "Is there still time to ask for forgiveness?" The veteran closed his eyes for a moment and replied, "There is always forgiveness, but perhaps not for the entire city." Outside, the catapults sang in unison. The sound was like a chorus of flying stones, and each impact sounded like a war drum, announcing not just physical destruction, but the end of an era. The roar of the walls, mixed with the noise of the engines, sounded like a lamentation no one wanted to hear. The older general, looking at the growing crack, tried to hide his fear with anger. "Reinforce. Don't stop working. This city will not fall." But even his voice was trembling. Nahum looked at him and said loudly, "Pride is the biggest crack in Nineveh, and no mason can repair that crack." Silence fell like a weight on everyone. The roar of the walls continued, low, deep, frightening. It seemed as if the stone itself wanted to speak, but no one dared to truly listen. The younger sentry gripped his spear tightly, trying not to tremble. "If the wall decides to fall, veteran, do you think anyone will still have the courage to stay on top of it when the ground starts to open up?" "Stay on top of it?" The veteran repeated, his hand still trembling on the vibrating stone. "Boy, the wall can hold bodies, but it can't hold guilt." As the roar of the engines echoed outside, the silence inside Nineveh began to hurt more than the noise of war. The people's eyes could no longer feign tranquility. Children hid in their homes, but the elderly, driven by curiosity or fear, ran to the squares to hear Nahum. He, firm as an unshakable rock, raised his voice. "Woe to the bloodthirsty city! Woe to the city full of lies and robbery! Violence and plunder do not depart from it." The words fell like invisible arrows. The people murmured. Some tried to cover their ears, others wept silently. The memories everyone wanted to bury surfaced, like corpses floating after a flood. A well-known merchant, owner of overcrowded warehouses, raised his voice. "What blood does he speak of? We are men of commerce." Nahum looked at him with unwavering eyes. "Of the blood that cries from the invaded fields, of the weeping of the sacked cities, of the children carried away as merchandise. The Lord has seen the weight of the silver you count, and every coin smells of tears." The merchant turned pale, but still tried to retort, "Such is the law of war. Whoever wins takes possession." "The law of men does not silence the judgment of God," replied the prophet. The nobles in their palaces began to grow restless. Rumors spread. The foreign prophet speaks of corpses, speaks of witchcraft, speaks of a future that smells of death. The women of the court exchanged glances, remembering secret sacrifices offered to idols on nights of the new moon. The men averted their eyes, remembering the caravans of slaves that had sustained their banquets. A young soldier, hearing the complaints, murmured to the veteran, "Is what he says true? Does the city really carry this blood?" "Yes, it does," the old man replied. "I marched on campaigns. I saw cities burned. I heard the screams of people tied up. The generals returned laughing, and we soldiers were forced to laugh too. But here inside, I never forgot. Nahum did not mince words. Woe to those who seduce with spells and enchantments. Woe to those who sell entire nations for their own gain. The Lord is not deceived. This city's past will be hammer upon anvil." A heavy silence fell. The past, which everyone had tried to hide, now hammered at their consciences. Every face seemed to recall a scene. A looting, an injustice, an ignored tear. An irritated nobleman tried to raise his voice. "Who are you, man of Elkosh, to accuse the city of kings?" "It is not I who accuse," said Nahum. "It is the blood that cries out and God who answers." The crowd retreated. Some tried to take refuge in the narrow streets, as if escaping the sound meant escaping judgment. But the echo of the prophet's voice remained. Even the animals seemed restless. Horses neighed for no reason, dogs barked into the void, birds rose in flocks without anyone scaring them away. The younger sentry looked down at Nahum. "He talks about blood. I thought it was an exaggeration, but I remember when they brought captives, tied up like cattle. I remember the silence of the women dragged by their hair." The veteran closed his eyes. "These aren't memories, boy. They're witnesses, and witnesses don't keep quiet." The prophet raised his arm towards the palace. "You who bathe walls in ivory and water tables with wine, know that the blood of the poor does not disappear. The Lord of hosts will call you to account." The noble's heart sank. They remembered the nights of orgies, the banquets where music drowned out the screams of prisoners. And now, before the prophet's words, nothing could drown them out. Afternoon fell upon the city, heavy as lead. The roar of the walls still echoed. But the roar of conscience was worse. The younger sentry turned to the veteran, almost voiceless. "If the blood cries out like this, and if God has already heard, do you think there is still a way for Nineveh to escape the hammer that descends on the anvil? Deceive the eyes of God." The younger sentry repeated, his voice breaking. "Not all the shields in the world can hide an entire city from what heaven has already decided." "Yes, boy," the veteran replied, clutching his spear to his chest. "But the king thinks color can cover a crack." The announcement resounded in the palace courtyard like anticipated thunder. The king of Nineveh, surrounded by his generals and priests, stood before the hastily summoned crowd. His voice echoed among the columns and statues, trying to sound firm, despite the tension already rippling through the alleys. "Nineveh will not fall. The enemy will not see fear in our eyes. Paint your shields red and place them in front of our ranks. Then they will see blood before the battle even begins." The people murmured. Red shields. The idea seemed bold, but also strange. Blacksmiths were summoned, and basins of pigment were scattered around the square. Men dipped brushes into thick paint and ran it over the cold iron. Shields old and new were held aloft in the sunlight and soon gleamed bright red, as if already stained with fresh blood. One of the soldiers proudly raised his arm. "Your Majesty, when the enemies see this Red Sea, they will think they have already been defeated." "They will," another added, "and fear will be our secret weapon." The king smiled with satisfaction, believing that gesture would be enough to calm the city. But from the midst of the crowd, Nahum's voice rose, clear as a sword cutting through the mist. "Woe to the bloodthirsty city, full of lies and robbery. You paint iron red to deceive men's eyes, but you cannot wash away the true blood that cries out from the earth." The applause that had echoed seconds before died away. Some tried to laugh, but it was short, nervous, like someone trying to hide a shiver. A woman grabbed her husband's hand and whispered, Painting does not stop stone or water. Keep your voice down, he replied, looking around. There are soldiers everywhere. One of the generals, enraged, advanced against the prophet. Enough of this poison. Don't you realize it's discouraging the people? It's not I who discourages, said Nahum. It's the lie that weakens. Whoever trusts in color has already lost the truth. The general raised his hand as if to strike him, but stopped himself. The people's eyes were too watchful, and the shadow of fear was already deep. Meanwhile, freshly painted shields were raised in rows. The red glowed in the afternoon sun, and for a moment the king believed he had revived the city's spirits. He ordered the heralds to proclaim, "See the power of Nineveh! See the blood that stains the enemies even before they reach our gates!" The people responded with timid applause. It was more obedience than conviction. Even the youngest soldiers looked at their shields strangely, as if that color reminded them not of victory, but of omen. Suddenly, the sound of galloping horses echoed through the western gate. Scouts, drenched in mud and water, rushed in, nearly falling from their horses. The first one could barely speak. "Your Majesty, the river." "The dikes." The king descended a step of the staircase. "Speak properly, man." The scout gasped, leaning on his knee. "The rain's in the mountains. The Tigris is higher than ever. The dikes, some have already cracked. Others won't hold out for much longer." A murmur of panic ran through the crowd. Red shields were no use against raging waters. Some soldiers tightened their arm straps, others lowered their eyes, unable to hide their fear. "Lies!" the king shouted, his voice trembling with anger. "The river has always protected us. It is our moat, our barrier. It has never turned against us." But as if in answer to the king's cry, lightning tore through the sky. The white light illuminated each red shield, transforming them into living flames for an instant. The thunder that followed made the houses tremble, and even the horses neighed in fright. Nahum raised his hand to heaven and declared, "The Lord has spoken." You trusted in painted iron, and in rivers you thought you could tame. But the river obeys its creator, and water will be the key that unlocks the gates of this city. No one answered. Even the generals stood motionless, staring at the darkening horizon. The wind carried the scent of distant rain, and the air itself felt like lead on their shoulders. The younger sentry looked at the veteran, his face pale. Tell me, old friend, if the dikes break, what good is this sea of red shields?" The veteran took a deep breath, gripped the spear handle, and replied in a low, almost lamenting voice, "Perhaps forward to deceive men for a moment. But do you really believe you can deceive the eyes of God?" "Deceive the eyes of God?" repeated the younger sentry, gripping the wall parapet tightly. "No paint, no iron, no king can achieve that." "Well then, open your eyes, boy," the veteran replied, pointing to the horizon. "Because now you're going to see what no one believed possible." The morning began heavily. The wind blew damply, bringing the smell of the river mixed with the loose mud from the banks. The Tigris roared louder than any catapult. The sound of the water crashing against the dikes sounded like the blows of an invisible hammer. Engineers scurried back and forth, trying to reinforce with stone and wood what could no longer be held. Their faces, covered in sweat and mud, betrayed the truth their mouths couldn't bring themselves to admit. The entire city depended on a tired wall. "Push more rocks," one of them shouted. "Put new locks on the floodgates." "Hold back the river?" murmured another, his gaze lost. "Who can hold back the river?" The people gathered in the squares, tense. Children cried. Mothers hid them inside their homes, while the men tried to show their resolve. But even the generals, seeing the volume of the water, swallowed hard before giving orders. Nahum raised his voice, firm, clear as thunder. "This is what the Lord says. The gates of the river will be opened, and the palace will be dissolved. You trusted in walls, you trusted in shields, you trusted in mute idols. But the Lord moves the waters, and no one can stop them. Some tried to laugh, but their laughter died in midair as a stronger wave crashed against the levees, shaking the ground. The sound echoed along the wall like the roar of a trapped animal, finally finding its way out. "Did you hear?" the younger sentry asked, his voice breaking. "Yes, I heard," the veteran replied. "It's not the enemy knocking. It's the river demanding passage." Outside, enemy trumpets began to sound long and piercing. The patiently waiting armies saw their chance to advance. Their banners fluttered, and the sound of their drums mingled with the raging river. The engineers shouted, "Hold! Hold the locks!" But the pressure was greater than human strength. Small cracks began to open at the base of the wall, and water poured from the crack, first in trickles, then in jets. Children pointed in fear. Women screamed. The soldiers, who had once held up their red shields with pride, now retreated a step without realizing it. A sharp crack shattered the air. One of the wooden floodgates, ancient and weakened by the current, gave way. The crash was like thunder crashing into the city. The water rushed in furiously, sweeping away mud, stones, and men. "No, impossible," a general shouted in despair. "The walls of Nineveh never gave way." "Never until today," Nahum replied. "The Lord spoke, and the impossible happened before your eyes." People ran in all directions. Horses reared, carts were swept away by the current. The ground turned to mud in an instant. The king, perched atop the palace, paled. His crown seemed small compared to the force advancing through the streets. The younger sentry, trembling, grabbed the veteran's arm. "Do you see? The doors have really opened." The old man closed his eyes, resigned. "I see, boy, and now I want to see who will have the courage to say that God didn't speak first." The enemy trumpets blared louder. The warriors advanced, using the gap opened by the river. The impossible, which everyone said would never happen, was happening before thousands of eyes. The youngest sentry swallowed hard and asked, his heart racing, "And if the waters have already decided the end, will any of us still have anything to hold on to?" "Anything to hold on to?" the veteran repeated, his eyes fixed on the torrent that swept carts and men through the streets. "Boy, when the river opens its doors, no stone or wall can hold it back. Now we'll see if we have the courage to face what comes next." The afterward arrived quickly. Through the gaps opened by the river, the enemy swarmed in. Their trumpets echoed within the city, mingling with the roar of the waters. The first groups advanced in formation, shields in front, spears raised, eyes cold. There was no rush, only method. Every step seemed rehearsed. Nineveh's soldiers fought back. Red shields were raised, but they were soon stained with mud and blood from the initial clashes. The sound of iron clashing against iron echoed through the narrow streets. Women screamed, children ran in despair. The air smelled of sweat, gunpowder, and fear. Nahum, in the midst of the people, raised his voice again. "Woe to the bloodthirsty city! What the Lord has spoken, you now see. Fire will consume your warehouses, and the screams you once ignored will now fill your avenues." And so it happened. The invaders, as if already knowing where to strike, threw torches at the wheat and wine warehouses. The fire spread quickly, fueled by the dry wood and cloth stored in piles. Within minutes, flames shot into the sky. Dark smoke covered the rooftops, and the streets were filled with ash that fell like cold snow. "Set it all on fire," shouted an enemy commander. "Let the city itself swallow what it has accumulated with blood." Nineveh's generals ran back and forth. Some ordered resistance, others retreat. The confusion was so great that the soldiers didn't know who to obey. One shouted, "Defend the palace." Another shouted, "Secure the gates." Yet another ordered, "Retreat to the inner walls." "Who's in charge here?" shouted a captain lost in the smoke. "If we don't have a clear order, everything is lost." "You're already losing it," replied another, spitting blood. "Discipline has collapsed." And indeed it was collapsing. Soldiers dropped their shields to help their families. Others ran in the opposite direction. Some tried to defend the market while the palace was already burning. The king, locked in his corridors, screamed for reports that never arrived. The fire and noise drowned out all messages. The younger sentry, still high on the wall, looked into the city. "It's fire, veteran. Fire on every avenue?" "Yes, boy," the old man sighed. "What started with the river ends with flames." Screams tore through the palace corridors. Servants tried to salvage coffers, but were cut down before they could even cross the gates. Nobles hid in dark chambers, where gold shone brighter than hope. In the streets, flaming horses ran aimlessly, spreading even more terror. Nahum did not keep quiet. "This is the end of pride. What was once strength turns to ashes. What was once celebration turns to mourning. The Lord warned, but you stopped your ears. Now who will listen?" A furious general tried to silence the prophet. "If you had kept quiet, the people wouldn't be afraid." "The people are afraid because they see fire," Nahum replied. "And fire cannot be put out with lies." Chaos grew. Orders arrived too late, and when they did, there were no soldiers in position to carry them out. The discipline that had once been the pride of Nineveh dissolved in the face of the flames. The younger sentry clenched his fists helplessly. "Tell me, veteran, if even the avenues of great Nineveh burn with fire, who will have the courage to believe that there is still a way out?" "To believe there's still a way out?" the veteran repeated, wiping the sweat and soot from his face as he watched the fire consume the warehouses. "Boy, the way out was already closed when the city chose to trust in pride rather than God." The flames advanced like snakes, climbing walls, bursting through doorways, licking rooftops. The air was heavy, a mixture of smoke, iron, and fear. Soldiers ran aimlessly, some trying to put out fires with buckets of water, others simply abandoning their weapons to save their own lives. Order, which had always been Nineveh's greatest pride, was crumbling before the people's eyes. Inside the palace, the scene was even more chaotic. The throne, once surrounded by haughty guards and fawning advisors, now looked like an island about to sink. The corridors leading to the royal chamber were filled with screams. Panicked servants, nobles fleeing with purses full of coins, and coffers being dragged away like rubble. One of the counselors stumbled, knocking over a gold box, which scattered across the floor. Desperate men and women threw themselves on the coins, fighting like starving dogs. The king, perched on his ivory chair, saw the scene and turned pale. "Where are my guards?" he shouted, standing up. "Why don't you defend the palace?" But no one answered. A servant dragging heavy bags tried to justify, "Your Majesty, everyone thinks about saving what is theirs. No one obeys orders anymore." The king pushed him away angrily. "Oh, infidels! All infidels!" Nahum, in the midst of the smoke-filled square, raised his voice like an unquenchable thunder. "This is what the Lord says. Where there is stolen treasure, there is no security. The gold you have accumulated will be blown away like dust by the wind. The river you swore was a wall has opened the door to the end." The words reached the ears of the soldiers and also the heart of the king, who could no longer hide his despair. He paced back and forth in the throne room, stepping on carpets soaked in ash and blood. The golden banners that once shone from the ceiling now hung blackened by smoke. A general burst through the door, wounded, his armor cracked. "Your Majesty, there's no holding back the invaders. The river has opened up and they've swarmed in. But the river was our defense," the king shouted, pressing his crown against his head. "The river always protected us." "He protected us until the day God decided otherwise," said the general before falling to his knees without the strength to continue. The king staggered, his hand reaching to his forehead. His crown, heavy and already stained with ash, seemed to slip. He held it tightly, as if it were his last hope of keeping the city standing. But the truth burned before his eyes. The river, which had always been his confidence, had become the silent enemy that opened the doors to his doom. The younger sentry, looking down at the smoke rising from the palace, murmured to the veteran, "See, Even the king's crown no longer shines. You see, yes, boy, the old man replied, his voice bitter. It's the weight of lies that brings down even kings. In the midst of the chaos, as advisors fled and treasures rolled across the ground like ownerless stones, the king shouted, trying to be heard above the roar of the fire and the enemy trumpets, "Guard the throne! Guard my life!" But no one obeyed anymore. Everyone ran to their own side. And Nahum, standing before the people, declared, "When the crown wavers, it is because the kingdom has already fallen before the Lord." The younger sentry, with a heavy heart, turned to the veteran and asked in a trembling voice, "If even the king realized that the river opened the door to the end, what will become of all of us when the crown finally falls to the ground? What will become of us all when the crown falls to the ground?" asked the younger sentinel, his eyes welling up and his voice breaking. "Well, boy," replied the veteran, staring at the misty horizon, "then the city will discover that it is nothing more than an empty den, even if it still tries to roar like a lion." Dawn brought an eerie silence. Where once there had been war cries, generals' orders, and soldiers' footsteps, there was now only the crackling of the flames still consuming the warehouses and the distant wails of a few survivors. Smoke covered the rooftops, and the streets were littered with ash, charred pieces of wood, and nameless bodies. The barns, once brimming with wheat and wine, were mere stone skeletons, their walls blackened by fire and doors shattered. Nahum walked slowly through the squares. Each step seemed to carry not only the weight of destruction, but also of fulfilled prophecy. He raised his voice, clear even in the heavy silence. "Where is now the lion's den, where they fed undisturbed? Where are the cubs, the prey brought, the roaring of power? The Lord has destroyed them, and the city that was called great is nothing but ashes." The words echoed among broken columns and mutilated statues. The wind blew, sending a broken shield rolling across the square, as if mocking the power that no longer existed. A boy, who was hiding with his mother in the rubble, looked at the prophet with wide eyes. "Uncle, where did everyone go?" Nahum replied tenderly but firmly, "They were taken by the very evil they created. The city lived on blood and lies, and now it reaps silence and dust." The veteran, who was descending from the walls with heavy steps, stopped in front of the devastated square. "I served here for decades. I saw parades. I saw generals hoist trophies. I saw banquets that lasted all night. Today, nothing remains but smoke." "Yes, there remains," said the youngest in tears. "There remains the memory that even the strongest can fall." The two stood in silence for a moment, staring at the empty avenues. Burned-out cars lay on their sides like dead beasts. The squares, once bustling with commerce and music, were now scenes of grey and desolation. Nahum proclaimed again, "The Lord has brought down the pride of this city." Before the stones fell, its name was already erased. No one will ever call Nineveh invincible again. A group of defeated soldiers ran past, aimlessly. Some dropped coins on the ground, others dragged broken swords. They looked like shadows of men who had once marched proudly. The youngest sentry commented, "Even they have lost their faces. They are no longer warriors, they are ghosts." The veteran nodded, his head bowed. Ghosts of a city that died before it even fell. The silence was broken by the cries of women searching for their dead among the rubble. The sound of their sobs echoed like a collective lament, louder than any war trumpet. The wind stirred the dust, covering faces and memories. "Look around," Nahum said, pointing to the remains of the walls. "The city that once thought itself eternal is now an example to the nations. Whoever looks at these ruins will remember that no one can defy the living God and remain standing." The sun, obscured by smoke, painted everything a somber red. There was no bird song, no market noises, no children playing. Only silence, only emptiness. The lion's den was deserted. The younger sentry, swallowing hard, turned to the veteran and asked, "If the name of the city died before the stones even fell, Will anyone ever remember that Nineveh once existed here? Will anyone still remember that Nineveh once stood here? The veteran repeated, watching the smoke rise from the ruins. Yes, boy, but not as a memory of glory. They will remember it like you remember a wound that never healed. That day, Nahum's voice echoed like a final sentence over the city. He stood amidst the rubble and spoke to the few who still remained, his eyes brimming with tears, but firm as stone. This is what the Lord says, your wound is incurable, your wound is painful. All who hear of your fame will clap their hands over you, for upon whom has your iniquity not continually passed? The silence that followed was heavy as lead. Each word of the prophet seemed to pierce the soul of the dead city. Nineveh, which had for so long thought itself invincible, was now compared to a fallen, bleeding body, with an open wound that would never heal. A group of women, hidden behind a burned column, began to cry loudly. A man, his face covered in ash, tried to protest, but this cannot be the end. We are the capital of kings, the crown of nations. Nahum looked at him with a hard look. That is precisely why the Lord brought judgment. The greater the pride, the greater the fall. The more blood spilled, the louder the cry that rises to heaven. The veteran grabbed the younger sentry's shoulder. Do you remember the campaigns I heard about? He said, his voice breaking. Entire peoples trembled at the mere mention of Nineveh. I remember, the boy replied. What now? Now they are the ones applauding. They applaud not out of hatred alone, but because the yoke has fallen from them. Indeed, news traveled fast. Messengers carried reports of the fire, the flood, the invasion. Peoples once humiliated, cities that had been sacked, families that had mourned for generations, now clapped their hands upon hearing the fate of the bloodthirsty city. The echo of judgment traveled farther than any Assyrian standard ever carried along the empire's roads. A survivor, staggering, fell to his knees before Nahum. Prophet, is there really no hope? Not even a chance to get up? No, Nahum replied firmly, because hope only exists for those who repent. And Nineveh did not repent. It chose to trust in walls, in chariots, in red shields, in rivers, and in stone gods. Now all is gone, and what remains is an incurable wound. The wind blew hard, kicking up dust and ash. The young sentry wiped his eyes and muttered, so the city died from the inside out, like a body that cannot heal. That's right, said the veteran. She was wounded in the soul before she was wounded in the stones. Nahum raised his arms to the smoke-shrouded sky and declared, the Lord of hosts has shown his justice. What seemed eternal has fallen. Let all people know, God is slow to anger, but great in power. Judgment was slow, but did not fail. The few who heard fell silent. The crackle of burning wood seemed to confirm every word. The sound of catapults was gone. Only the echo of the past, never to return, remained. The youngest sentry took a deep breath and said in a low voice, as if afraid of the question itself, if Nineveh's wound is incurable, veteran, will the whole world learn from this? Or will we still see other cities heading towards the same wound? Will other cities still walk toward the same wound? The veteran repeated, staring at the thick smoke rising, covering the sky. Yes, boy. Because men forget quickly. But today, before your eyes, the Lord has written in history a warning that will not be erased. The crackling of the flames was no longer just a sound. It was as if the city itself were breathing fire in its final breath. The flames rose high, dyeing the sky a dark red, as if it were a final sunset. There was no birdsong, no clinking of coins, no shouts of military orders. Only fire, only wind, only falling. The chariots, once the pride of Nineveh, lay overturned in the avenues, reduced to twisted husks of iron and wood. The spears, that had once pierced so many peoples, lay broken and scattered across the ground. The squares, once filled with music and celebration, were now corridors of ash and silence. Nahum raised his arms, not in triumph, but in confirmation. The word has been fulfilled. Nineveh, which sold fear, now buys oblivion. She who thought herself eternal has been extinguished like a torch in the wind. Some survivors, hidden among the rubble, wept softly. They no longer had the strength to flee, nor the courage to fight. All they saw was fire consuming the walls and columns that had once supported the city's pride. The younger sentry slowly descended from the wall, his steps heavy. He approached the veteran, who remained standing motionless, staring at the destruction. "It's over, isn't it?" The old man nodded, without taking his eyes off the flames. "It's over. What was left of glory has burned away, and what was left of name has been erased. Now only memory remains, and memory is dust." Nahum spoke again, his firm voice cutting through the silence. "The Lord has shown that no human power can stand against his justice. The day was delayed, but it has come. The city that roared like a lion now groans like a wind in ruins." The young man in tears murmured, "So this is it? All the fear Nineveh spread, all the arrogance, all the cruelty, gone in a flash?" "Yes, boy," said the veteran. "All the fear they sold was for nothing. In the end, they only bought oblivion." The flames rose once more, tall as walls of fire, illuminating everything around them. They seemed like a final flash, a final goodbye. When they were extinguished, nothing would remain but ash and memory. Nahum lowered his arms, closed his eyes for a moment, and said, "Thus ends Nineveh. Not by the sword alone, nor by water alone, but by the hand of God upon pride." The fire roared as if confirming the words. And the younger sentry, his face still illuminated by the glare, looked at the veteran and asked in a low voice, almost a whisper, if even the name of Nineveh was extinguished in the fire, who will be the next to forget that God cannot be mocked? The memory of Nineveh was recorded not only as ruins of stone and ash, but as a mirror for all generations. The city fell not because it lacked strength, but because it overflowed with corruption. The splendor of its palaces hid the darkness of its crimes, and the weight of its power could not sustain the emptiness of its injustice. Judgment came because pride blinded the eyes of its leaders, and violence became the ground on which they walked. Nahum's prophecy was fully fulfilled, showing that God's justice never fails or delays. When the time comes, no wall, no army, no throne can stop the truth. What happened to Nineveh is more than past. It is a warning for the present, for the same question echoes in our days. How often do we repeat the mistakes of that city, believing our actions will go unpunished? How often do we seek security in wealth, status, and power, forgetting that all of these are fleeting, like dust blown by the wind? The fall of Nineveh reveals that human glory is fragile, but it also reveals a path of hope. If pride leads to downfall, humility opens the doors to life. If injustice breeds destruction, repentance restores us to God's mercy. Thus Nahum's message spans the centuries. Pride always ends in ruin, but those who bow before justice find refuge. Let us learn from the past before it's too late. For cities fall, empires vanish, but the word and righteousness of the Lord endure forever. If this story spoke to your heart, 2 other videos will appear on your screen, featuring prophets who also witnessed God's judgment and mercy. Click subscribe to the channel and like. May the God who shook the gates of Nineveh and raised the banner of eternal justice speak to you too, because sometimes the greatest revelation only comes when we realize that no human strength can withstand the Lord.